Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr, and I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar with James Osorio. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC, or The Joint, the leading Jewish humanitarian organization that has been providing assistance to Jews around the world for more than a century. Regarding our material, some of these materials go all the way back to the organization's founding in 1914. Our Holocaust era records are especially extensive since JDC was active in Jewish communities across the globe during that time. These resources are used constantly, not just by scholars, but also by publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and many others from around the world. A big part of what makes our collection so accessible is that much of the material has been digitized and is available online. This allows a broad international audience to explore and use the archives from wherever they are. We also support researchers through several fellowship opportunities that encourage deeper engagement with the JDC archives and help expand scholarship of our collections. One of these fellowships is the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship. It was established in 2012 in honor of Ellen Lewis, a German Jewish refugee who worked for JDC in Shanghai and later in New York. Our speaker today, James Osorio, received the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship in 2025. James is a PhD student in history at Brown University. He has been awarded grants and fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the National World War II Museum, and Brown University's Watson Institute Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, among others. His scholarship has appeared in the Journal of American Studies and the International Journal of Armenian Studies. James will present for about 40 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. Please note that your microphones are turned off and we'll take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. James will now start his lecture.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the JDC Archives team for giving me this opportunity and platform to share with you the early stages of my research. The materials that I have managed to acquire at the JDC Archives have been such a tremendous resource for me, not only in the past year, but more importantly in the future as I finish this research project. My presentation today broadly attempts to put in conversation the histories of the Holocaust, the Philippines, and the Second World War's Asia-Pacific theater. In order to do so, I center the life stories of Jewish refugees who arrived in the Philippines between 1938 and 1941. To be sure, two monographs have explored the Jewish exile in the Philippine Islands. We have Escape to Manila, written by Frank Ephraim, which recounts his experience as a child refugee in the Philippines. We also have the recently published book, Philippine Sanctuary, written by Bonnie Harris, which shows the institutional history of the Philippine rescue missions. Both books thoroughly answer the question, what happened to these refugees? That said, what Ephraim and Harris adumbrated, in my view, is the amplitude of the refugee lived and embodied experience. This is what I am interested in. I am interested in not in the concept of history as object, but in the history as lived, or history from within. Therefore, the overarching question of my presentation is, how did these Jewish Holocaust refugees experience exile, first in a tropical, semi-autonomous American colony, and later in a Japanese-occupied territory from within? And in order to answer this question, I am attentive to the polyphony of the refugees as intimate life worlds, meaning the everyday intersubjective world as perceived, sensed, and lived through a refugee's body. In turn, I focus on the sensorial, emotional, spatial, temporal, and relational dimensions of their everyday lived experiences. Furthermore, attending to the inner and outer horizons of exile troubles the historiographical assumption that refugees' perceived whiteness conferred privilege. As you will see in the presentation, I show that in the Philippine context, perceived whiteness operated asymmetrically, carried different meanings, and had limited value in an unincorporated American territory seeking full sovereignty and virtually none after the onset of the Japanese occupation. To be sure, this presentation is not a complete portrayal of the embodied Holocaust refugee experience in the Philippines, but rather I would like to think that this is a fertile starting blueprint. Again, this presentation is all about everyday perceptions. It makes a case that within the Holocaust cartography of flight and exile, the experiences of Jewish refugees in the Philippine archipelago took shape as contingent and specific embodied life worlds. As I will show, these embodied realities were shaped by tropical ecologies, arbitrary colonial orders, and geopolitical warfare, as well as a refugee citizenship, age, gender, and economic ability. These structural, social, and individual forces pressure the everyday lives of Jewish refugees, while also redefining their modes of shared belonging and self-understanding. Still, it is because of these pressures that Jewish refugees manage to carve out avenues where they can creatively express or assert themselves through ritual, community organization, cultural participation, and daily improvisation. These seemingly elusive practices enable them to stitch together threads of familiar life and endure the course of their exile. But before anything else, for us to understand the Philippine connection to the Holocaust and the embodied life worlds of Jewish refugees in the islands, it is also important to place these narratives within the longer, although unevenly documented Jewish past of the archipelago. Existing scholarship has shown that as early as the 16th century, Jews fleeing oppression in Europe, along with the so-called Oriental Jews from the Middle East, settled in the colonial Philippines where they engaged in port-based trade and maritime commerce. The American purchase of the Philippines in 1898 further reshaped this nascent Jewish milieu as scores of business-oriented American Jews arrived in the archipelago. Later, the founding of Temple Emil in 1923 symbolized a slowly increasing relevance within the social fabric of the country. By the time the islands became a Commonwealth entity in 1935, the American-led Jury of the Philippines were already active members of the society. And though a minority of roughly around 500 members from diverse backgrounds, news of Nazi persecution fostered a united Jewish consciousness in the Philippines that drove them to help save 1,318 European Jews. My presentation is divided into two sections. The first, which I call Tropical Life Worlds, illustrates the efforts of the Jewish refugees to renew and continue their displaced lives in the Philippine Commonwealth. The second part, Besieged Life Worlds, echoes the fast-paced yet disordered character of refugee experience during wartime, which is reflected too in the way refugee survivors narrate these experiences in their testimonies. As the refugees approached the shores of Manila Bay, they curiously beheld the Philippines as a collage of natural terrain, native scenes, Spanish residues, and American modernities. Hans Steiner, a 31-year-old Jewish lawyer from Vienna, perceived the composite identity of the newly minted Philippine Commonwealth even before his ship made port. Hans recalled seeing stretches of different trees, huts made out of bamboo and palm leaves, and tropical vegetation. At the heart of each village stood a church in the Hispanic style, visible as far as one could tell from a distance. Hans also saw bamboo canoes and colorful triangular sails navigating in the waters at an incredible speed. Then, as the ship entered Manila Bay, the might of the United States Far Eastern Fleet visually greeted Hans and the other refugees. The sight of cruisers and four-stacker destroyers demonstrated disciplined naval order and power. It was an image very impressive to any ordinary person. But For Hans, this visual melange led him to call the Philippines not only his new home, but as a country that appeared full of promise. In the eyes of the recently arrived refugees, Manila was a city color of white. Frank Ephraim, who was only 8 years old when he arrived on March 16, 1939, observed how near every man, except for the dock workers, was dressed in a white suit. In time, adult while male refugees came to understand that the white suit meant something in the Philippines. The white suit, or informally known as the Americana, was a sartorial passport into the Americanized society and a visible marker through which men can symbolically align themselves with the elite and ruling class. And so, upon their arrival, Jewish men such as 18-year-olds Ernest Berger and John Odenheimer had white suits made, which they wore whenever they appeared in public. But while the white suit implied socio-political belonging, it did not offer protection from the skin-deep discomfort of exile in the tropics. Lot Hirschfield, who also arrived in the Philippines when she was 8, recalled how her father agonized over the stinging heat. Indeed, many refugee children remembered how irritated their parents were from the oppressive heat, but nevertheless, they remained optimistic. For example, the young couple Max and Mark Grunwald wrote to their cousin in Europe on November 1, 1939, that they would accustom themselves gradually more and more to the tropical climate, describing the Philippines as a peaceful island despite its aggravating heat. Aside from the heat, refugees also needed to learn how to live with unfamiliar flavors, odors, sounds, and the creatures animating their new environment. Many refugees found eating to be difficult. Ernest Berger, for example, had a hard time adjusting to Filipino food. In his 1996 testimony, he explained that it was the way in which our delicate taste was brought up, explaining that his struggle was tied not to prejudice, but to the conditioning of his palate. Edith Lang also recounted the cheerlessness of her first meal upon arrival. She remembered how she got some noodle soup with ants swimming in it, and while eating, the strange sound of tukos, or Philippine nocturnal gecko, increased her anxiety. Frank Ephraim remembered the smell of fried dried fish, the taste of the awfully sweet Coca-Cola drink, and the sight of random spiders and cockroaches skittering across the ceiling of his family's apartment. But other refugees recalled these sensory adjustments in much kinder terms. Jack Slippets, for instance, remembered how he enjoyed the taste of papaya despite being nasally alerted by its peculiar odor. Hans Steiner, too, remembered the warmth and conviviality of a Filipino celebratory banquet with a roasted pig at the center of the table, served on banana leaves and eaten with one's hands. These sensory rites of passage, to be sure, slowly adjusted the refugees into their new environment. But more pressing demands of daily life soon became apparent. One of these demands is language. Although German remained the refugee community's lingua franca, life in the American Commonwealth of the Philippines required them to learn English for everyday life. Here, refugee children learned faster, not least because adult refugees were too busy securing employment. Many refugee children acquired English through the oral and visual immersion facilitated by their Filipino teachers. Some refugee children recalled being made to sit quietly in class, listening and reading the materials posted on the walls and board. In only about 3 or 4 weeks, they were able then to communicate. Other refugee children who moved to predominantly native Filipino neighborhoods learned Tagalog better than English. Surrounded by Filipino playmates, they absorbed the native language by singing folk songs and playing folk games. For some, like the child refugee Max Weisler, speaking Tagalog became a powerful marker of identity. In his interview, he said that being Filipino was his second identity, shaped by growing up and living in the Philippines. To clarify, refugees adapted to the Philippines in varied and uneven ways. Beyond sensory and linguistic adjustment, emotional attunement was also crucial, shaped largely by their living conditions and the material and social environments they navigated. Those who arrived with some financial resources or who had distant relatives and contacts already in the Philippines often found the transition less jarring. But for those whose property were robbed by the Nazis in 1938 before they escaped Europe, adjustment was far from easy. Newly arrived Jewish individuals or families had to live in shared dorms or apartments where space was limited and privacy nearly non-existent. Edith Lang and Gita Vox remembered how refugees had to put curtains in between hospital-type beds in order to create the illusion of having separate rooms. These crowded lodgings often became flashpoints for resentment, especially among adult refugees who could not find alternative housing. Ursula Progel, who was only 5 at the time, remembered how the adults would argue over something as small as a missing kitchen utensil and how those petty conflicts could quickly turn into fistfights. For John Odenheimer, an 18-year-old refugee on his own, the dorms felt extremely isolating and depressing. Bedbugs, dirty conditions, and the unfriendly atmosphere from other refugees only intensified his sense of self-estrangement. But much of the inner despair weighing on so many refugees arose from the difficulty of getting employment due to the labor structures present in the newly minted Philippine Commonwealth. The everyday search for employment became a demoralizing routine for adult male refugees. Soon, they realized that the existing colonial standard was working against them. In simple terms, their Europeanness was a source of narrowing, not widening of opportunity. Refugees were socially prevented to engage with the same jobs as the Filipinos. They can only apply as a salesman, bookkeeper, or an accountant, and even then, it is hard to get employed without a suitable personal recommendation. This realization, to be sure, runs counter to an official report from May 17, 1940, which attributed these employment struggles to anti-Semitism. But across these testimonies consulted in this presentation, refugees uniformly reject the presence of anti-Semitism among the overwhelmingly Catholic native population. In fact, adult refugees recounted a sense of indifference too, not from Filipinos, but from the supposedly responsible for their care. For example, in his memoir, Hans Steiner recalls that Philip Frieder, one of the Jewish American businessmen involved in the rescue effort, often treated the refugees condescendingly. Frieder seemed to believe that they, quote, must have done something wrong in Europe and should be treated accordingly, end of quote. Steiner's reflection is that Frieder failed to grasp a basic truth, that although they were refugees who had been rescued, they were still free individuals with agency over their own lives. In any case, for all the unavoidable burdens and tensions of exile adjustments and social frictions, the Philippines nevertheless gave Jewish Holocaust refugees something essential, a place to live. As Frank Ephraim wrote in his memoir, Filipinos were a tolerant people who never interfered nor took any action against the Jews. In fact, when the atrocities of Kristallnacht bled through the consciousness of Filipinos, local protests condemning Hitler and the Nazi regime reverberated in the streets of Manila. Furthermore, Jewish refugees worshipped openly, moved through the city's cultural terrains, and found themselves involved within the Philippine society. Certain spaces in particular became vital architectures of refugee life: schools, a synagogue, and a boulevard. Fascinatingly, many refugee parents enrolled their children in Manila's parochial schools, the Jesuit-run De La Salle College for boys and the Benedictine-led St. Scholastica's College for girls. Of course, Jewish families encountered minor difficulties in getting their children exemption from Catholic services. However, what remained important is that these schools offered the rigor and polish of private education for a relatively affordable price. For the parents, maintaining their children's schooling was a priority, not least because it symbolized a carrying over of their Jewish values. Harry Brower, who was 13 at the time, recalled that his father placed enormous value on his education. After securing steady employment in the Philippines, he used his first reliable income to pay for Harry's education. Indeed, refugee children thrived and flourished in Philippine schools. They learned native songs, performed in school events, played local children's games, and shared midday meals with their classmates. Margot Kastenbaum, who arrived in the Philippines at age 7, remembered Filipino children offering their hamburgers to refugee children whose parents could not afford them during lunchtime in schools. She also remembered eating Filipino desserts, such as the sweet and buttery ensaimadas that Filipino children passed across the lunch table. In this sense, schools were more than a place of intellectual development for the refugee children. It was a place of belonging in which they could imagine themselves not as temporary guests, but as genuine members of the community. In another part of Manila, Jewish refugees found community at Temple Emil. The city's only synagogue, it became the symbolic fiber binding Jews together across traditions, whether they were Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative. Indeed, once the synagogue finally hired a rabbi in 1938 and a cantor in 1939, all major Judaic holidays and festivities were then duly observed. But beyond just a place of worship, Temple Emil also acted as an intimate sanctum of Jewish social life and cultural expression. Shabbat was observed along plays, lectures, and informal gatherings. Adult refugees moved from sermons to dances, while the children learned Hebrew and played games with each other. Lot Hirschfeld remembered taking music lessons as well as performing Yiddish theater, while Frank Ephraim recalled wearing a clown costume for a Shakespearean play. Gita Vox recounted how her parents were Temple Emil's unofficial impresarios, hosting musical soirees for adult and Austrian-themed dress-up parties for children. She even credited her parents for producing the synagogue pier and plays. But if Temple Emil formed the heart of the refugees' intimate world, Dewey Boulevard, now known as Rojas Boulevard, became the pulsating public artery through which refugees absorbed the life of Manila. The boulevard, lined with palm trees and scattered benches, stretched nearly 8 miles along the coast of Manila Bay. Refugees describe it as a recreation park, the people's grand meeting, and a lookout point. In his memoir, Frank Ephraim wrote that it was along this extensive promenade where adult refugees, after a day's work, took their afternoon or evening walks, where refugee children played the German outdoor sport Capture the Flag, and where newcomers were first introduced to the old-timers, themselves ironically only a few months into exile. So the boulevard was, for the refugees, as a space where one can discern the diversity of peoples in Manila as well. For instance, Jacques Lapetz reminisced seeing people of totally different ethnic backgrounds, particularly Filipinos and Chinese, each speaking their own native language. Frank Ephraim shared how he mischievously snooped around mestizos and mestizas, or Filipinos with Spanish heritage who were engaged in courtship. The boulevard was also a place for sugary pleasures. Refugee children remembered the ice cream vendors who offered welcome frosty respite from the tropical heat. For many, though, ice cream itself still felt like a novelty. Most families could only afford one kind of ice cream, the modest chocolate popsicle. They also recounted another beloved figure, a Filipino peddler who wandered the boulevard with a tray of American chocolates and confectionaries strapped around his neck. Refugee children, as Frank reflected, recognized something of themselves in these vendors. The sweet candies and confections they sold remained beyond the means of both the peddler and the refugees. It was an unspoken kinship and an educational aftertaste that instilled in the refugees an understanding of the bitter economic hierarchy within the Philippine Commonwealth. Of course, above all, Dewey Boulevard was, for the refugees, a scenic oasis. Refugees like Jack Lipetz often remembered the postcard-like beauty of the sunset, its colors, and the cool breeze of the sea drifting from the bay. But in Frank Ephraim's memoir, the boulevard was a bittersweet place that stirred an ambiguous feeling of homesickness. Strolling and gathering along the waterfront offered the refugees a sense of freedom, but it was tinged with nostalgia. Every night, Frank described, the newcomers watched in wonder as the sun swelled into colossal orange orb sinking slowly into the storm-bruised waters of Manila Bay, washing the clouds in somber crimson. The talkative refugees became wordless. Their thoughts were overtaken by a shared solemn recognition. The Philippine sunset, Frank elaborated, made the refugees realize how, quote, their former lives in Europe had disappeared forever. Lives that, unlike the sun, would not rise again. And in that suspended moment, the silhouette of their new world came into focus, filling them with a silence and ease. Though before long, this murmured unease would swell into a crescendo of sirens and bombs as the encroaching forces of Imperial Japan crept towards the refugees' beloved Boulevard. Jewish refugee children were seated in their classrooms on the morning of December 8, 1941, when their teachers started gathering all the students. But the children already knew what had alarmed the adults. Only hours earlier, their parents had learned by newspaper or radio that at about 1:55 a.m. Manila time or 7:55 a.m. on December 7 in Hawaii, Japanese aircraft had bombed Pearl Harbor. Now the tremors of that attack had reached the Philippines. The refugee children were loaded into caratelas or horse-drawn carriages and sent home through streets already gripped by panic. But that night, Jewish refugees and the rest of Manila heard the city cry out as air raid sirens wailed moments before Japanese bombers roared overhead. The unforgiving assault of Japan's airborne fighters produced a landscape of ubiquitous fear, destabilizing the everyday routines and temporal perceptions of Manila's populace. For the refugees, accounts of the bombardments differed. Some claimed the bombing started during the morning, while others insisted the attacks came exclusively at night. Esther Zelikovsky, a Jewish teenager from Shanghai en route to America but stranded in Manila after Pearl Harbor, provided a more balanced recollection. In her memoir, she recounted how air raids came during both day and night, that the sound of the air raid signal became very familiar. However, the alarms rarely served their purpose. As she clarified, Japanese planes were already above the city when the alarm sounded. The lateness of the bomb alerts only intensified the panic rather than control it. Moreover, the air raids transformed communal space and function for the refugees. Temple Emil, for example, went from being a religious and cultural space to a bomb shelter. The circular staircase inside the synagogue proved to be useful protection from falling shrapnel. But this spatial reconfiguration also mirrored institutional operation. Rabbi Joseph Schwartz, who was a refugee himself, noted that the outbreak of the Pacific War caused the immediate reorganization of the refugee committee, not least because, amongst other problems, the war tripled the number of Jewish individuals needing welfare. By January 2, 1942, Japanese troops penetrated the city of Manila, formalizing the occupation the bombings deafeningly presaged. Refugee accounts portrayed the coming of the Japanese forces as a spectacle, one that heightened pre-existing feelings of anxiety and uncertainty. Esther Zelikovsky remembered how at dawn, loudspeakers blasted broadcasts announcing the entry of the, quote, great and glorious Japanese army. Refugees who saw their entrance portrayed the Japanese troops as small, poorly dressed, and brutal looking, but the sheer image of the way they forcefully scattered in the streets remained injuriously inked in the eyes of the refugees, especially the children. Gisela Golombek, then 9 years old, recounted how the Japanese came in on their bicycles like a horde. Gisela sourly described the spectacle as an appalling sight, while Esther focused on the bayonets the soldiers carried. But for Margie Rosenthal, who was 15 at the time, the Japanese invasion triggered multisensory responses rooted in her trauma from Nazi persecution. As she heard the Japanese coming in at night, the awful rhythm of their marching bodies orally activated memories of Nazi parades, which immediately generated a fear for her life. Furthermore, her account complicates the story because she identified the initial arriving troops as mostly Koreans, while also emphasizing the terrible stench coming from their uniforms, strong enough to seep through her closed windows. Following the invasion, Manila soon gave birth to an internment camp. Civilians with Allied citizenship were herded into Santo Tomas, a 3 centuries-old Catholic university turned camp. Among the internees were the American Jews who had long managed Manila's Jewish community. As Rabbi Joseph lamented, the sudden disappearance of American Jews was a severe blow for the refugees. Some refugees, such as Esther Zelenovsky and her mother, entered the barbed wire Santo Tomas voluntarily, believing that internment provided a safer alternative. By contrast, Jewish refugees holding German or Austrian passports were spared internment, despite the blood red J stamped inside. Indeed, what mattered to Japanese officials was not their Jewishness from within, but the despicable swastika, a symbol that to their eyes confirmed German nationality and thus Axis allyship. Thus, their Nazified passport, symbolizing their displacement, became, in wartime Southeast Asia, an unlikely protection. Even so, this came at a painful cost. German and Austrian Jews relied on their passport, not out of allegiance to Nazi Germany, but because they were desperate to stay alive under Japanese rule. That said, Manila's Anglo-European residents saw these survival tactics as betrayal. One French woman even went so far as to describe Jewish refugees as, quote, hot Hitlerites, and accused them of being phonies planted by Hitler in the Philippines. Such comments suggest how neighbors interpreted refugees' as survival performances of identity as ideological inconsistency or even espionage. Nevertheless, everyday life in occupied Manila was defined less by grand policies than by an oppressive regime of embodied docility, consisting of bodily regimentation, surveillance, and the thinning of the body, all aimed at chastening the Philippine populace long before command became coercion. To begin with, Japanese sentries encompassed the entire capital, monitoring civilian mobility and suppressing freedom. Every encounter with a sentry demanded a precise contortion of the body, a bow. However, as many Jewish refugees recounted, there was a certain protocol to this gesture. A bow held too briefly or too shallowly could lead to physical abuse, yet refugees noted that even ordinary Japanese officials disagreed on what the proper standard was. In other words, bowing standards depended on the individual Japanese soldier. Nevertheless, refugees emphasized the numbing repetition of such ritualized choreography. Japanese authorities also incorporated daily calisthenics into their broader agenda of bodily discipline and kinesthetic control. Here, a disembodied, omnipotent voice shouting commands through the croaking funnels of loudspeakers coordinated these routines. Known as Radyo Taiso, this sonic tyranny disciplined the body from afar, especially that of the children. As the child refugee Frank noted, everybody had to go out at lunchtime and do Japanese-style exercises, whether in the streets, on rooftops, or on schoolyards. Everyone, Filipinos and refugees alike, had no choice but to participate. Around 1943, Rabbi Joseph successfully persuaded the Japanese Bureau of External Affairs to officially classify Jewish refugees outside the internment camp as stateless. While this should have institutionalized their neutrality of the community, refugees nevertheless found themselves under the unblinking gaze of the Kempeitai, or Japanese secret police, whose watchful suspicion exacerbated the paranoia and hypervigilance they already felt every single day. On the one hand, the Kempeitai arrested male refugees for unclear reasons. On the other, refugees remembered being so convinced that their communication lines were tapped that they habitually spoke in careful euphemisms and codenames when referring to the Japanese and the occupation. As Rabbi Joseph explained, in the eyes of the Japanese secret police, the refugees were still suspects and therefore had to be surveilled. Accordingly, the secret police made unannounced visits to the synagogue and even sat inside among the congregation to ensure that no anti-imperial Japanese opinions were voiced. Refugee children even remembered how they could tell when a Japanese secret police officer disguised in a kippah was among them during Shabbat. But bodily regimentation and surveillance were only the beginning. The Japanese intensified everyday oppression with the more intimate and deliberate scourge of hunger. Because of the occupation, the Philippines became isolated, which meant that import stopped. This made food rationing necessary for survival. Rabbi Joseph and his wife established a community kitchen at Temple Emil to help ease the food crisis. But even this proved unsustainable in the long term, and its closure was a massive blow to refugee families in severe financial distress. At Santo Tomas, the small and already isolated refugee contingent, especially those who strictly observed kosher dietary laws, felt these hardships even more acutely. Child refugee Gisela recounted how persistent hunger became such a constant state that it produced intermittent hallucinations. Still, the ever resourceful refugees learned to adapt. Those in the city and in the camp adopted various survival strategies, including growing local Filipino produce and raising livestock such as chickens and ducks. Refugee children remembered tending small food gardens where their parents planted corn, lima beans, and camote, or native sweet potatoes. German Jews outside Santo Tomas did not forget those who were interned. Child refugee Gunther Leopold recalled being tasked with smuggling food to Jewish internees. Children were often chosen as food couriers because Japanese soldiers did not see them as a threat. Also, Frank Ephraim remembered how Filipinos helped by providing food to the internees despite the danger of being caught. On September 21, 1944, the refugees heard the beginning of the American troops' campaign to recapture the Philippine capital. Many refugees remembered this day in different ways. But for Margaret Velish and her two daughters, Susie and Gita, it was both comical and spectacular. The three women were walking home from the market when the familiar Japanese dogfights began. At this point, the people in Manila were already used to these aerial target practices. As they pointed out, they were distant, almost playful, and never truly harmful. But that day, the illusion of fun quickly disappeared as Gita saw the smoke change color from harmless white to a troubling gray. Almost immediately, a Japanese plane crashed to the ground, and the curiosity of the people watching turned into panic. Suddenly, shouts roared through the streets, announcing that American pilots had finally infiltrated Philippine airspace. Margaret, Susie, and Gita ran blindly for their lives as shrapnel began to rain around them, striking rooftops with sharp percussive clicks. The refugees greeted Uncle Sam's bombs in varying ways. For some refugees, the air raids were an audiovisual promise that liberation was impending. They remembered feeling wonderful, even joyful, as American planes flew overhead and released their explosive cargoes on Japanese military bases. Other refugees immediately felt the danger and proximity of the bombings, especially when leaflets fell from the sky ahead of the American shelling. Since there were no built bomb shelters in the city, people had to improvise, especially the refugees, since Temple Emil had been taken over by the Japanese. As Margaret Velish said, the Japanese filled the synagogue with ammunition with the intention of setting the entire synagogue on fire. And so refugees constructed makeshift shelters by digging 3-foot deep pits in their yards, stopping just before they hit groundwater. Jewish refugees in the Santo Tomas internment camp were relatively safe. They were reassured by the presence of Americans among the internees, since this meant that American planes could not bomb the camp without killing their fellow Americans. But at this point, the Japanese authorities began retaliating, and this fell squarely on the refugee community. Basic necessities and material goods vanished first. Refugees remembered how Japanese soldiers plundered the entire city and worsened hunger and malnutrition among the population. They began to see people collapsing in the street from starvation. Moreover, for German and Austrian Jewish refugees who were conspicuously white and unmistakably other in the Japanese-occupied Philippine society, suspicion intensified and their homes were seized. Jewish families were expelled from their homes, so Japanese officers could use the space in preparation for the looming battle with Americans. Some refugee families experienced expulsion multiple times. Again, the fear and insecurity that these refugees thought they had largely left behind in Europe quickly returned. The liberation of the Santo Tomas internment camp on February 2, 1945, amplified the wrath of the Japanese towards the civilians of Manila. This, in combination with unrestrained American weaponry, created a microcosmic world oriented towards death. Here, the contrast was sharp. While refugee internees at Santo Tomas experienced relief through camp liberation, civilians beyond the barbed wire, including the remaining refugees, were plunged into a brutal struggle for survival that would stretch until Manila's liberation on March 3. At this point, the Japanese finally detonated the ammunition in Temple Emil. At the same time, American units pushing in all directions compressed the Jewish refugee community and their Filipino neighbors into an ever-shrinking no man's land alongside Japanese soldiers. Before long, these Japanese soldiers, slowly consumed by anxiety and desperation, enacted a scorched earth policy. They began burning government, commercial, and even residential buildings. Refugee children remembered the smell of gasoline that Japanese soldiers threw onto their homes before setting them ablaze with hand grenades. Adult refugees recounted watching the fire spread rapidly. They also remembered how Japanese soldiers began shooting through the windows as the fire slowly consumed their homes. Jewish refugees quickly grasped the reality of the situation. In a war-torn city, the very idea of shelter depended on manual skill. Ferdinand Lang described how each attempt at survival demanded new forms of creativity. He wrote in his diary that he and his family continuously built makeshift shelters out of corrugated iron. Similarly, Gita remembered how her father, Rudy, incessantly dug elaborate foxholes with indented iron roofs packed with sand as they moved toward Manila Bay. Then, they moved from one foxhole to the next. Along the way, the sensory assault of the necrotic world around them intensified the struggle for survival. Gita recalled how the chorus of individuals and families praying, moaning, screaming, and crying in their own foxholes competed with the deafening blasts of bombs and artillery. She also remembered how the air itself bare witness. The decaying stench of dead horses and livestock mingled with the acrid miasma of bloated Japanese and Filipino corpses. The sight of these distorted, almost rubber-like bodies only worsened her fear and terror. Meanwhile, other refugees survived not through resourceful labor, but through the thin membrane separating one moment of inhumanity from the next. During the 1945 trial of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, 3 German Jewish refugees testified to the indiscriminate violence they experienced at the hands of Japanese soldiers. The first refugee witness, John Levy, recounted hearing Japanese soldiers enter the Philippine Red Cross building where he and at least 10 other refugees were hiding. The soldiers opened fire, killing everyone, while John barely survived. He then described crawling into a toilet stall after being shot, only to realize that a Japanese soldier had followed him with a fixed bayonet and stabbed him again and again. The 2 other refugee witnesses, Walter Frankel and Hans Lorse, were together when they experienced similar horrors. Japanese soldiers had forced their families, along with several Filipino families and workers, into Hans's residence and bound their hands behind their backs. As it turned out, the soldiers were preparing to burn them alive. They poured gasoline and alcohol around them and set it on fire. As the flames intensified, the captives begged for their lives, but their cries fell on deaf ears as the soldiers began shooting them one by one, including Walter's and Hans's wives. When the house filled with smoke and flames, the soldiers left, and that was when both men escaped. During the trial, the men still bore the visible traces of the event, layered scars from the fire that transformed their bodies into corroborating documents. To sum up, these accounts show refugees fled not only the hazards of crossfire, but also the widespread terror of arson and indiscriminate violence against civilians. Furthermore, for refugees, wartime eroded the remaining boundaries that had once separated communities. Simply put, all civilians were equally vulnerable. As Margot Kastenbaum declared during the Pacific War, quote, "There is not a question of being Jewish or not Jewish. All of us went through a terrible period of suffering, but not because we were Jewish. That's a very important difference. Our lives were equal to those of the Filipinos under the war," End of quote. Refugees trapped within the battlefield experienced liberation in varied ways. Some managed to slip into safer areas, while others waited out the fighting in shelters. For most refugee children, liberation was associated with the sight of American tanks and troops and the jubilant noise of ordinary Filipinos. But liberation was not entirely an end. Their life worlds endured, and whether they stayed in the Philippines or went elsewhere, they carried with them everything they had lived through. The Philippines persisted as a lived horizon within them. While conducting this research, I had the pleasure of interviewing Eric Lippitz, who lived in the Philippines as a child refugee. And even now, 8 decades after Manila's liberation, Eric still bears the legacy of his Philippine past. His hearing aids represent the auricular residues of the Second World War, the noise, the sounds of the bombing and artillery, which impress themselves upon his ears. But when he closes his eyes, a familiar and peaceful register of experience returns. As he says, quote, I remember the sunset, the beautiful sunset, seeing it, watching it while walking on Dewey Boulevard. This is where I conclude my presentation, but before I turn it over to Dr. Rohr, I would like to take this opportunity to mention that this is a long-term project. I continue to search for primary sources and other materials related to the lives of Jewish refugees who live in the Philippines. And so if anyone in the audience has materials related to the Jewish exile in the Philippines, such as diaries, documents, or other sources about the refugees' lives, even before they came to the Philippines, sharing them would be an enormous help to my research. I'm also planning to broaden the scope of this project by telling the story of the refugee experience after the war. So this means that I hope to include the voices of descendants as well. So if any descendants of the refugees in the audience would be willing to be interviewed in the near future, please do not hesitate to contact me by email. Thank you so much for listening.
It has been a fascinating lecture, James. Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor to questions. Just a reminder that your microphones are turned off, and we'll take questions via the Q&A function. And I see we already have a few questions. I think there's a question on how the refugees came to the Philippines, and it's it's a triple question really. Did the majority of Jewish refugees have relatives or friends already in the Philippines? If they did not have relatives in the Philippines, how did they even find out that the Philippines was accepting refugees? And linked to that question, were there Filipino government officials writing visas in Europe?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, this is exactly what Bonnie Harris's book is trying to address, this institutional history of the rescue missions. And so some of the refugees definitely had relatives and friends already in the Philippines. And that's why a lot of the information that the Philippines is giving what's giving visas is through the mouth, through the word of mouth. But there's also an institutional background because the first, I hope I get this right. The first mission was actually from Shanghai Ghetto with the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War there. And so some of the German refugees in Shanghai went to the Philippines, facilitated by the Refugee Committee in Manila. And because of that success, it attracted the attention of the JDC and other refugee committees. And so that became like sort of the starting point of this rescue operations. And the Hilfsverein for Juden, I forgot the entire Jewish institution name in Germany, also collaborated with the Refugee Committee in Manila. And at first, it was just the Refugee Committee would say things like, oh, we need doctors, we need professionals, we need this and this kind of people with these different jobs, and give that paperwork to the Hilfsverein in Germany. And that particular organization in Germany would then find these people and issue visas for them. But but again, like there's a lot of like loose ends here too. Like it's a very porous operation because at one point the refugee committee in Manila had a lot of power to just give visas. Bonnie Harris's book explains this more comprehensively, but there's at one point like between 1939 to 1941 where the refugee committee had so much power just to give visas to Jewish refugees in Europe. But a lot of the information, at least in the refugee testimonies that I've managed to watch and peruse, some of them involved like through the word of mouth, like, oh, there's this consul in Breslau or in Paris that's issuing Philippine visas. You should go there, things like
that. Was there any Nazi presence in the Philippines?
Actually, there was. There is a small German club in the Philippines, but it's a very small presence. But there was a testimony by Jack Slippets that I did not include in my presentation, but it will be in the dissertation that talks about how they were in a restaurant and suddenly this German who's a Nazi sympathizer, but was based in the Philippines, like just spewing anti-Semitic propaganda and all of that. But there were definitely, they're not a majority or they're not a real powerful presence, so to speak, but there were Germans who are Nazi believers in the Philippines, and in their houses too. Like I found some testimonies that says they saw the Nazi flag in the apartment or the houses of these Germans. So
and was that presence felt more after the Japanese invasion, or
both before the Japanese invasion and after?
Right.
But again, like it wasn't like an overwhelming presence, because also like even the refugees would say that the Japanese soldiers hated the Nazis for some reason. Like they hated each other. They're politically and allies, but the common opinion amongst ordinary Japanese and especially the soldiers were not that great towards the Nazis. Yeah.
So there's a question. You mentioned refugee children learning Hebrew at Temple Emil. Can you say something about Zionism broadly among the refugees? Do you know how widespread was Zionist sentiment? Were there organized Zionist activities in Manila?
That's actually one of my agendas in the future. But I can just tell like my quick tangential knowledge so far. Jonathan Goldstein has talked about this too in his book about the Jewish history in East and Southeast Asia. But and this is very conjectural based from my tangential knowledge, that the Zionist sentiment became definitely. There are some instances of Zionism before the war ended, but the formation of the Zionist consciousness was strengthened after the war. And it's so interesting because I was just from yesterday. I was in a attic of the house of a descendant of a Jewish refugee, Frank Ephraim's daughter, Michelle. I was in her attic and I was looking at the different documents that her father left, and there were copies of newsletters written by the youth group, Jewish refugee youth group who live in the Philippines, and they were just writing about their experiences in the war. They were writing about the situation in Palestine and and also the declaration of the state of the Israeli independence. And so I would say that the Zionism was strongly felt after the war and strongly formed, and that's, I think, the reason why the Philippines is the only country in Asia to sign the Declaration of the State of Israel.
And do you know if many of the refugees went after the war? Like, is it, are you looking at where they immigrated to after the war?
Yes, from what I have so far, many of them went to the US first. Some of them went to Australia, but I don't know to what extent I have to, but I do have the records of that. I haven't perused them. But many of them went to the United States, and later on in their lives, I think after um, they were settled and they had children, they eventually moved to Israel. Max Weisler was and Ralph Price, for example, were those children who lived in America for quite a while and then eventually moved to the state of Israel.
Okay, so we have a few other very specific questions. Were Jews who kept kosher able to do so in the Philippines? I don't know if you've seen anything about it in your research.
Yes. This is related to the rescue operation. So the refugee community around 1939 felt that they needed a butcher, a Jewish butcher who knows how to prepare meat for the community. And so that's one of the specific profession that they included in the paperwork that they sent to the Hilfsverein in Germany. And so specifically say we need a Jewish butcher, and there was um, someone who arrived as a refugee in the Philippines, but specifically to prepare the meat for the community.
That's fascinating. And we also have a questions about the relationship between the refugees and the Filipinos themselves. Were there any marriages, were there marriages between refugees and some Filipinos?
Yes, there was to be really honest, I've only seen one instance of that. Um, there was a refugee testimony that mentioned a co a, but I did not even specify if it was a refugee or someone who is of Jewish descent already in the Philippines at that time and intermarried. I would assume that it is someone who had already been there. Um, but there is one refugee that married an American. That I know for sure. But with the assimilation into culture, I think with the refugees, especially the refugees who went after Kristallnacht, um, because of they would describe the society as very Americanized, and there was really no, um, again, like there was really no barriers. I think most of the barriers are in terms of economic and financial. But for example, the children learned folk songs, and even now, I have testimonies where they would perfectly sing Filipino folk songs by heart, and so I would say like um, yeah, like I'm playing with this theory of interstitiality, like Jewish refugees and Jews permeated the spaces of both the elite Americans and Filipino elites, and also the Philippine ordinary Filipinos and the ordinary populace. And so being assimilated was not that hard, although the English, at least for the adult refugees, was really painful experience for them, because again, with the pressure of like just getting a job was a priority, but then they cannot get a job if they can't speak English, and so that was a real problem.
Now we have some general question about your research. How did you come to the concept of Lifeworlds, which structures your research? Were there any other concepts you drew on and consider and then discarded to reach this analytical perspective? And
Yeah.
more generally, how did you come to this topic, and what was the more surprising to you in your research on this subject?
Okay. I think I'll answer the second question because that
For sure.
would
I think it might be
yeah.
the same person sending all those questions.
Um, so I came into this topic because, well, I'm from the Philippines. I'm Filipino, but I studied I'm also a classical pianist, and I studied in University of Santo Tomas. I attended there, and I learned all of this internment. It's history of internment camp and all of that. But one person who was a Jewish refugee that is still famous in the Philippine music world is Herbert Zipper, who was the conductor of the Manila Symphony Orchestra during when he arrived and during wartime. And he, until now, he's credited as someone who changed the way Filipinos approach orchestral conducting. And so I learned of that. And there was I remember before I left the Philippines to study in the US as a music student, I attended the centennial concert recreating the concert that Zipper held after the war, where he played Beethoven's Eroica Symphony and Dvorak's A New World Symphony. And so this history, like I know of this story, but then during at some point in my academic career, I wanted to write something. I came back to the Holocaust. I was trained as a musicologist and eventually went to sensory history. I was writing about music in concentration camps and the sense in concentration camps. And my advisors and mentors here at Brown had advised me to, like, why don't you write about the Philippines? Because you know these connections and stuff. And so that's where I came to this topic and really dive more into the Jewish refugee experience in the Philippines. And also I have a personal connection because my grandfather was a guerrilla soldier during World War II. So there was that sort of tangential connection. The idea of Lifeworlds came to me because theoretically I align myself with phenomenology, and I feel like the concept of Lifeworlds just capture, my interest in the sensorial, in the emotional, in the body, in the emotional, and the everyday. That's what I'm interested in. And so, like, for example, in the presentation, I never mentioned the officials like Manuel Quezon. I barely mentioned them. The higher ups in the refugee committee. I really want to center ordinary people, and I feel like the philosophical and the theoretical basis of Lifeworlds just captures that. And as a historian, I feel like I'm a believer that in writing history, as a scholar, needs to be grounded in theory, and this theoretical perspective was just helpful for me to make sense of all of the sources that I have and to tell a very a rich story, which is my main goal at the end of the day.
Well, thank you, James. I mean, thank you for sharing your research with us, and thank you for explaining the motivations behind it. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us today in the second programs of the JDC Archives webinar series, Across Oceans, Across Cultures, Jewish Refugees in East Asia and the Role of the JDC. The next program will take place on April 23rd. Brenna Miller will give a lecture on Jewish aid organizations and musical community building in wartime and post-war Shanghai. You can sign up for the program via our website or social media. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming events, we invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter. We look forward to welcoming you back to future programs, and we will share all the questions that have not been asked after the program. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today, and have a wonderful day.